Good evening and potentially good morning and good afternoon. I'm not completely sure all of you joining online where you may be based around the globe, but pleasure to host you today. My name is Salguero-Gomez. I'm a tutorial fellow in biology here at Pembroke. And together with my partner in crime, Professor Nick Hawes, tutorial fellow in robotics and engineering. Did I get the title? And introduce yourself later. Anyways, we want to tell you a bit more about some of the synergistic work that we have been working on together, both our labs and our students, both within Pembroke and beyond in the last 3-4 years. And I want to maybe share the anecdote of how our collaboration came to be. The short of it is I gave a talk at an alumni meeting where I presented both fellows and alumni of the college with all the ecological problems that I'm currently faced with. And Nick very kindly came to the rescue because as an engineer, he's very much obsessed, I would say, with fixing problems. And trust me, there's a lot in ecology, which is my science. So fast forward, we're developing a pipeline that is expediting the time, the efficiencies, and the power with which we can monitor ecological systems. And that's part of what we want to tell you today. So what's remarkable in the last decades is the technological advancement to me. Just a few years ago, Amazon started to deliver packages with drones. Also, a few years ago, our very popular Nick Hawes was meeting with Prince William. I always get confused between William and Harry. Harry's the problematic one at the moment, right? Yeah.
I mean, they're all wrong.
Yeah, that's not So anyway, so Nick was introducing William to Betty, I believe is her name, which is a robot that he'll be telling you more about that has been showcasing some of the potentials of autonomous robotics in closed environments. I mean, some of the work that we have been doing since is actually taking this technology to more complicated environments, open environments. These wonderful developments are a drastic contrast with the backdrop of two crises. One of species loss, the biodiversity crisis, which at the same time is only getting further aggravated by the second crisis, the climate crisis. As things get warmer, more species go extinct. As we humans continue to do an excellent job at transforming habitats, more species are getting extinct. And other species are doing all too well, invasive species. The consequence of which is biodiversity going down and the ecosystem services that nature provides, spanning from the clothes that I'm wearing, this beautiful wooden podium that I'm leaning on, to pretty much everything that you ate this morning. All of that given to you by Mother Nature is going down the pipe if we continue in this trend. So much so that one of the most influential ecologists, the late E.O. Wilson, famously said a few years ago that we are actually losing species at a much faster rate that we are describing them, let alone manage them. And one of the key points here is that as a biologist, we cannot dream to conserve what we don't understand, let alone what we haven't even identified. So he made the point of really getting more boots in the field to describe and understand species so that we can better manage them, to which I'd like to add that not only do we need more boots, we need more rotors of drones, we need more wheels of robots as well. Now, I want to showcase some of the work that my team in the Department of Biology and here at Pembroke has been doing. So we've been collating demographic information, those are rates of survival and reproduction, of hundreds and hundreds of animal and plant species around the globe. And we've made all of this information open access in the Compadre database. You've got the URL up on the slide, and you're very kindly welcome to peruse through the database. Through this work, I've become acutely aware of the fact that the demographic information that we have, I apologize, that's going to auto move. The demographic information that we have for plants in green and for animals in blue is geographically biased. We tend to look at things that happen to be really close to where the main universities are based. Europe, North America, some of them in Oceania. I apologize. This is a bit annoying that it's going back and forth.
Is it the way I started it?
I'm not completely sure, but that's okay. I'll just continue to go back. And there are many areas for which we know little to nothing about the demography of those species. And it is precisely the demography, the rates of survival and reproduction, that help us ecologists predict extinctions and invasions. Now, this work led by one of my PhD students, Maria, also did a very comprehensive report of where the animal demographic knowledge was coming from against the backdrop of vulnerability. So you have got some studies around the globe for, in this case, this is mammals. And then in gray tones, the degree of climatic vulnerability around the globe. What you can see is certainly a mismatch. Again, a lot of the data points, the demographic fieldwork that is taking place is in our backyards. But that is not necessarily where we need it the most. Sea areas in Latin America, Africa, Polynesia, for instance, those are the areas that are going to be hit the hardest by climate change. Another challenge that we're faced with is just how tedious the collection of these data are. And typically the collection of these data have been performed today by a lot of human labor work with blood, sweat, and tears. We train people, we send them to the field. Let me put this. It's a little bit, how do I, animation. I think if I do this and then control A, how do I stop it? So it doesn't go to auto advance.
Would it be in slideshow?
Slideshow, yeah, it might be. Thank you for that. Use timings. There you go. Okay, let's try that again.
Now you see what academics really do.
From here.
Mostly making slides.
Excellent. Okay, so there is a mismatch between where we do the fieldwork, from which we can then go on and make predictions, and where we actually need those predictions. Okay. And another challenge that we're faced with is that the classical ways of collecting this data is really tedious. We train people. People are expensive, by the way. People are also fallible. Okay, so we train people, we send them to the field. This, by the way, is a much younger Rob. This is me doing fieldwork in Utah during my PhD. Okay, what we do is we set permanent plots to study plants, for instance, or we mark animals with ear tags or other means, and we follow them through time, and we see who has survived, who has reproduced, and by how much, right? So this is hard work, okay? Long days, and in this case, nights out in the field collecting data. When you go far away, or even if you go to your backyard, you want to make the most out of that time, right? And it can be hot, it can be hailing, it can be raining. You have to carry on with the show. All of these contexts can actually affect the quality of your data. Some days you get exhausted, you make mistakes. Okay. Go to the field, collect the data, digitize it, build models, mathematical models, from which then you do predictions. All of this part, in my group, we know how to do really well. This part we're trying to move away from. I'll argue that this is the bottleneck of ecology at the moment, is the data acquisition, time-consuming, expensive, and as a function of how tedious it is, error-prone as well. So then the question and the dialogue that I've built with Nick is, can we actually do better? Can we actually use the drones of Amazon, as if it were, and the Wallis of Pixar as well, to automatize this data collection such that humans are placed where we perhaps need them most, which is in the building of the models, the validation, and the projections. So the main goal of the project that I'm going to be presenting you with Nick today is precisely to use some of the technology that Nick has been developing and other pipelines that we've developed in my group to automatize this. So we have been using autonomous robots from the Oxford Robotics Institute. We've also been, we've actually become pretty good at training drones to automatically collect data. And we have also been installing in situ sensors to evaluate responses of, in this case, hyper-diverse grasslands to different experimental treatments. So the pipeline that we have developed consists of the unification of the biologies and the engineerings, as if it were. And I'm in charge of the biology. So that's a part of the stream that I'm going to be telling you about a bit more today. And then Nick will hand over. I'll hand over to Nick, and then he'll tell you more about the engineering side. Most of the work that we have been doing up until now has taken place actually in our backyard. And you'd argue, wait a minute, you just mentioned you need it in South America. Yes, that's phase 2. That's coming. That's coming. We need to start in our backyard because we need to implement the technology where we can actually go and check and fix if something happens before we can deploy far away. That is the ultimate mission here. Okay, so this is Raindrop. It's a hyper-diverse grassland. What does hyper-diverse mean? You probably know that the tropical forest in Costa Rica is very, very diverse. Per hectare, you can find 60 to 100 different tree species. Okay. Within a square meter of this grassland, you can find 60 plant species as well. A square meter versus a hectare. So it is true that tropical forests are very diverse, as are other ecosystems such as reefs, but you don't necessarily have to go very far to find very special places. And this place is actually owned by the University of Oxford. This is part of White and Woods, which is one of the ecological jewels of the UK. It's the longest ongoing biological station in the UK. And much of the biology, much of the ecological understanding that has come and is used around the globe comes from our backyards. So we have a set of experimental treatments. We have put in place some infrastructure that allow us to, quote unquote, steal the natural precipitation from the plants. They are called rain-out shelters. These rain-out shelters are connected through a very eloquent system of pumps to other plots where the rain, 50% that is stolen, quote unquote, then gets deposited on other plots. We call them the rain plots, rain-out plots and rain plots. Okay, and we also have got other series of plots called control, where we're monitoring the responses of the grassland species to the background precipitation, whatever that may be. Okay. And in addition to that, 2 years ago, we added 2 types of treatments, part of a new ecological network called the dragnets. And these treatments have to do with some of the most important human agents that are shaping biodiversity, particularly in plants around the globe. One is mechanical disturbance. Think what cattle do in the field. Okay. Think about what we're doing when we transform the habitat. So what we did here is we hired a bulldozer and we disrupted the entire surface of different plots. And now we're asking questions about ecological resilience. That is, how quickly do different species come back, if they ever do, and under what conditions. And another main treatment here is chemical disturbance, aka fertilization. I don't think I need to tell you much about how much nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium we're actually pumping into the system so that we can actually feed mankind. And that is coming at a great cost to the preservation of different ecosystems. So we want to understand extremes of precipitation, both droughts and flooding, but also other perhaps more tangible, more direct effects of humans, such as mechanical and chemical disturbance. The ways in which we're doing that is we've become experts in the monitoring of ecosystems via sensors that are a bit more complex than our rather rudimentary human eye. So in our human eye, we see RGB, red, green, and blue. But actually, that's not the full light spectrum. The full light spectrum goes from infrared all the way to UV, ultraviolets. And it is precisely in certain sectors of the IR infrared that plant photosynthetic activity can be picked up. That's what we're seeing here. This is a part of a video of a multispectral drone where we are monitoring how much water stress they are under. So this patch there that we just flew by, that was a bryophyte. They tend to condensate water. That's what it shows in a different signature. Purple. Purple in this case means doing okay. Red is very hydraulically stressed. So those are patches of grassland that are under a lot of water stress. Green, incidentally, is quite water beneficial. So it has a lot of water. That's the rain shelter. So there's actually water on those gutters. Okay, so that's how you can differentiate. We have then gone on to quantify how the different spectral diversity that we can take photos from through RGB, red, green, and blue, or infrared and ultraviolet can be used as a shortcut, if you will, to quantify biodiversity. Again, the classical way of doing this will be I train my people, we go to the field, we spend days identifying, classifying species and quantifying how many of them are by area surface, right? What we're doing here, however, is we go to a specific plot, we take with a drone a photo on multispectral, and then we evaluate the range of the light spectrum with the following understanding. Different species will show a different signature in the light spectrum. There may be some species that pick up more in the blue. There may be other species that pick up more in the green or in the infrared. Close your eyes for a second, both here and at home. If you hear me talking, you'll be able to identify how many individuals are currently in the room, right? Just me, apparently. If we all talk at the same time, can I just do this silly example? Everybody at home, keep on closing your eyes. And everybody in the house, in here in person, please talk at the same time. Just talk about the weather, talk about anything that you want. Fantastic. That's lovely. So hopefully people at home have been, at home or online have been able to pick up the spectral quote unquote signal of this noise, right? Based on how much noise you've been able to identify, you might be able to guesstimate how many people there are in this room. This is no different than what we're doing here, right? So the band, the width of that band is actually potentially a proxy, we hypothesize, to how many people, how many grassland species can actually be found in the field. Just as people at home might have been able to identify that there are 10, including me, here today. Okay, so that's the whole idea. And what we have done, of course, is to identify with different proxies, quantifying the different moments of the different distributions. I won't go into great detail. Flying the drones on different plots, we take photos like this, and we identify on different brands of the light spectrum what is the width of that distribution, and then identify which width is actually most telling of the botanical data that have been collected using classical methods. So this is part of my troop, the next troop, some of which are Pembroke undergraduates. That's Jessie. She's a terrific third-year undergraduate in our group. And that is John, the postdoc who has led this work. And so what we've done is we have correlated proxies of biodiversity based on classical methods and run some really simple linear regressions to see if the width and different moments of the distribution of the spectral data can actually predict. Why is that important? We spend days doing this. Days. And that's in situ. That's not talking about the hours that we spend training the people. And I'm not going to tell you how expensive it is to train a postdoc. And by the way, at this point, thank you so much for all the donations to all of the alumni that make possible engaging with undergraduates over the summer. That's really meaningful, both to them and definitely to this line of research. This data we collect in 10 minutes. Of course, there's a lot of time that we have to invest in the processing, but that now can be done semi-automatically. And you might be dying to know, can you actually predict? The answer is yes, we can predict. So each of the points correspond to a value of biodiversity on each of the plots for which we flew drones using classical methods and then using the variance of the spectral radiance. If you want to know more about the results, there's a QR code that will lead you to the website where the paper was published just 2 months ago. Other things that we're now going to move on to do is to use machine learning by the hand of two postdocs in our groups, Erola and Man, to predict growth and to be able to not just identify how many species and what's the cover, but how much do they change through time? And that's actually a key question in ecological resilience. Resilience is all about being able to predict where are you going to be next, not just where you are now. So there's a component of quantifying all of these methods through time that we're very excited about. And on that, I will hand it over to the robotics stream. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob.
I just cancel that there.
Yeah. Cool. So Rob talked about how we can
or how we, not only how we can, but how we need to go beyond kind of human data collection. Let me get rid of that as well. When we're trying to characterize biodiversity, to monitor ecosystems. And the natural place to come in is to use autonomous systems to carry some of these sensors. So you've seen how we can use something like hyperspectral imaging to estimate biodiversity at a snapshot. But in order to meet the mission that we've been looking at, we need to do this at much greater both spatial extent and spatial scales. We need to go to larger spaces. We need to look more detailed in the spaces we've got, and we need higher fidelity temporal information. So we can't just go to a field once a year or in the growing seasons. What we need to do is get data every day, every hour even, and then use that to track trends, spot tipping points, early warning systems, and things like that. So the only way we can do that is by replacing the kind of the human labor with autonomous systems to carry these sensors and perform some of the missions. So that's where I come in. So my research is in decision making for robots. So in particular, my line of research deals with how do you get a robot to the right place at the right time to achieve some kind of task or mission. And in this case, the mission is to gather valuable ecological data. And so what I'm going to talk about for the rest of this is really to go through the kind of basically the sort of technologies we use for robot decision making at a very, very high level, and give you some examples of some of the deployments we've run to gather sort of ecological data with autonomous systems. And some of that will involve Rob and some of it won't, but we'll circle back to the work we've been doing at Raindrop at the end. So in particular, what I want to start with is kind of an overview of the kind of technology we use. So this is a Boston Dynamics Spot robot. It's running autonomously here. And what we want to do is use a system like that to carry a sensor payload around a large scale space. To do that, you need a couple of things. The first thing you need to do is characterize the space. So when Rob was using drones, he was either using GPS to localize the robot, so the robot knows where it is, but also probably using either GPS waypoints or manual intervention, so a human with a joystick flying the robot. We want to take that out of the loop and have the robot know where it is itself and navigate itself autonomously. And to do that, we start by building a map of the environment. So the map could be a set of GPS waypoints, or it could be, as in this case, a LiDAR, a 3D LiDAR reconstruction of the site. So here someone is joysticking, in fact, a guy called Michal Stanizicek, who's one of my PhD students, and this is joint work with a colleague, Maurice Fallon. He's joysticking Spot around here for the first time, so Spot can build a 3D map of this environment. Then what we do is we take this representation, which already contains some structure. So the green lines there were where the robot had been, and we can turn that into a graph, so a network. So what you see here are a sequence of, or a collection of these red arrows are locations the robot can go to, and the edges are actions the robot can perform to traverse between these different locations. And this is how we think about the world as kind of people working on autonomous robotics. What we want is our robots to be able to use these representations to plan where to go and gather data. So in this case, this might be an oil and gas scenario or a nuclear monitoring scenario where the robot needs to go there and read a dial or gather some readings. But ultimately, we're using this technology in Raindrop, where each one of these arrows corresponds to one of these raindrop plots. And we're going to plan for the robots to move around these spaces in order to gather data. So this gives you, this is really the level of abstraction that I work on. We kind of forget the robots and we just think about the routes the robots can take through these maps. So these blue lines here are possible routes. The key idea here is that the robot hasn't necessarily taken any of those routes before, but it knows, because it's built this map, it knows how to move through that space. And then once we do that, we can then run the robot autonomously. So in this video, the robot's running autonomously. It's coming through a doorway. It's taking routes it hasn't taken before. And at this point, we can walk away. We can say, okay, here's your mission, robot. Go and gather images at these 6 locations 10 times a day for the rest of your life. And the robot does that. The robot recharges its own battery. It performs these actions, and it uses the information about its environment to choose efficient paths to maximize the amount of data it gets on a single charge. So that's the kind of work we've been doing. And this is the kind of work that I was doing when Rob gave his talk, and I was like, hang on a minute, you want to automate all this data collection? Well, that's what I like doing. So this is where the kind of intersection comes. So that's the general idea. The takeaway from this is the kind of idea of graphs and robots moving on them, and those nodes in the graph, those positions in the graph, are places where the robot can gather data. So I'm going to give you a very different example, but still connected to the idea of gathering data about our environment. And this is work done in conjunction with the National Oceanography Centre and a couple of other universities, so Heriot-Watt and Newcastle, where we're looking at harvesting data from underwater sensors. So this is a long way away from grasslands in Oxfordshire. But the purpose is still similar. So ocean data is key for understanding climate change. So building models of how ocean temperatures change, how currents change, how things like the Gulf Stream adapt over the various changes we make through our atmosphere, that information is incredibly valuable. And to build models like this, oceanographers use things like, or climate scientists use ocean temperature, salinity, and these things can only be measured by going to a location and sampling the water. We can't measure them at a distance. So we really care about that data. But this data is very valuable, but very hard to collect. So typically, you either have autonomous vehicles roaming wild, which is amazing, but that's quite difficult to do right now. Instead, typically we have either fixed sensors on the ocean floor or buoys floating out at sea, which exist for a long time. They're very low-powered systems. They're gathering data, but then someone has to go and get that data. So typically, this is a big carbon-spewing boat full of expensive people that sails around and collects data from these buoys. This is a very expensive way to do it, but it's actually cheaper than using things like satellite comms. The satellite comms really drains the battery life of these things, and if they're underwater, then you can't have those comms anyway. So we want this ocean data, but it's very hard to retrieve. So we were working on a project to use autonomous vehicles in conjunction with a smart sensor network to gather this data. So the reason this becomes a bit easier is that we can use these sensors as part of the map. So in the previous video, I showed you this lovely 3D map using laser. That's how the robot knew where it was. If you take an eco-sub, so this is an autonomous submarine, it's about this big, it's tiny. If you drop that into the water, it has no idea where it is. It can't use light, it can barely use sound. And in the open ocean, there's not a lot for that sound to reflect off. So actually localizing, knowing where these robots is really difficult. But if you have the sensors actually emitting effectively sonar pulses or other kinds of telecoms pulses, you can use that for the robot to know where it is in a larger map. And then the robot can use the data it's getting to choose where to go and kind of suck in the data from these sensors and then return to home base. So we've been working on the same sort of problem, but now we're trying to use these underwater, highly uncertain robots. Robots are highly uncertain about their location to gather this data. We ultimately build very similar maps. So this is clearly a simulation of the kind of environments we're thinking about. The triangles are sensor nodes, and these hexagons are waypoints that we build in the graph. Now, this is a bit less direct than the land-based version. So in the land-based version, the robot literally goes somewhere, looks at a thing, gathers some data. In the underwater case, we actually have to use kind of triangulation. So the locations correspond to a signature, which is like, how many of these beacons can I see and how strong are they? So it's a bit like using GPS on your phone or on your car, but now we're doing it using underwater sensors or underwater beacons that are helping us localize the vehicle. And the vehicle can actually choose both where to go and how long to stay there, because the closer it gets to one of these beacons, the faster it can retrieve the data. But if it goes and sits on top of one of these beacons, it's got to spend a long time getting there. So this is part of the artificial intelligence problems we have to solve. There's a trade-off between the amount of data I get, the length of my mission, the battery life of the robot, things like this, and we have to optimize that to ensure that the robot is sensibly using its mission time to gather data that's going to feed back into these climate models that the scientists want. So we use some techniques called planning under uncertainty, where we represent the uncertainty of how the robot moves and the data, and we use that to create policies that drive the robot around in these conditions. We evaluated it. So this is Loch Ness. So we tested this at Loch Ness, where we had sensors over here, which were stuck to the bottom of the loch. This is Matt Budd. He's a PhD student of mine at the moment. He was also a Pembroke undergraduate engineer. And now he's a Pembroke postgraduate engineer. So he wrote the code and designed the algorithm to do this. And this is him setting off the vehicle off into the wild in Loch Ness. We're, as a group, really used to doing these kind of legged robots or wheeled robots. And when you set them off, you just watch them, and you watch them and they come back. Here, once this thing dives, you just sit there waiting for 2 hours. And sometimes it comes back and sometimes it doesn't. It's terrifying. It's like sending your children off to school. Strangely. So yeah, the vehicle goes off, it does its thing, and hopefully it comes back with data. And we get back plots from it like this. So this is going to be a lot of information that's probably not particularly useful, but it gives you a sense of the kind of things we're interested in. So here, this is recreated from the logs of the vehicle. what you get is these big circles are actually where the robot thinks it is. So occasionally it gets a little bit lost. And then when it gets close to one of these beacons, which are now colored stars, it can actually narrow down its location a little bit. And what you see as we go through time, what we're doing is we're collecting data from nodes. And these are kind of models of the data that's on these nodes. And what you see is as the vehicle goes through, you kind of drain data off them, which means it's collecting data. And the path the robot takes here, it goes near this yellow one, because this yellow one in its model thinks it's got very high value data. These other ones not necessarily don't have data that's quite as valuable. So the sensor on board is actually looking at things like the temperature dynamics in its local area and sort of going, is this kind of a dynamic I've seen before, or is this interesting data? And it can use that when it's pinging the vehicle. It can say, you should come here, I'm very interesting, or you should stay away, data is boring. And so the vehicle kind of goes close to the high value targets and then kind of skirts on the outside of the ones with less valuable data because it's less interested in gathering that data from there. When we do that, we can plot the results. So this is a comparison of our system in pink and the way that the ocean scientists were doing it before with kind of hand-coded set of rules. And higher means that we get better data. We get more good data in the amount of time. So the vehicle has a fixed lifetime based on its battery. And the more high value data you can get, the better your climate models, the better science you can do with it. And so this is my job in these projects, is to ensure that the robots are making the most of their time in the field to get data that's useful to feed into these models. So this shows that we did good work and we're all happy. So to move back closer to the Whiting work, I want to talk about a project which I'm not directly involved in, but Morris, who I mentioned earlier, in conjunction with the spot work, has started leading. And this happens at Whiting in a different way. What we're working on here is actually taking, so the device that person's carrying is the same device that was on the back of the spot that we're using to build that big 3D model. So it's a 3D laser or a LiDAR scanner plus some cameras, and the combination between those things allows that system to localize just like the robot did. Now, what we're interested in here is supporting sustainable forestry. So one of the major challenges in forestry is deciding what trees to cut down when. And this is typically done by having a human walk around and actually measure the diameters of trees over time. It's a very time, again, it's similar to Rob said, these are time-consuming data gathering tasks that expert humans have to do. But expert humans do them by walking up literally with a kind of tape measure or something. Whereas this device is measuring the entire time, and you can actually measure all the trees in this wood as you pass through. So you can take the same technology that the robot's using to work out where it is and build a 3D map that has the trees. And then you can take this map and actually go through and measure the trees automatically. So you can use these models to recognize trees. So they have a tree recognizer. So they've got a bit of software that go, oh, that's a tree, that's a tree, that's a tree, that's a rock. These are things that are labeled as trees. And then you can use this kind of, let's say, a quicker, again, it's sort of quick and dirty. So you saw with Rob's multispectral imaging, it's not 100% accurate, but it's giving you signal in very little time. And that's the same here. We're getting signal in terms of the tree diameters much faster than if you were doing that by hand. And the accuracy is not as accurate as a human, but it's close, and it's close enough to be useful. So Morris has been leading that work, and there's a new EU project started that's really focusing on combining many different types of robots. So drones like Rob uses, legged robots, and actually they're even building an autonomous tree harvester. It's going to take all this data and go out and rip out trees purely autonomously. It's utterly terrifying, actually. And to wrap up, I want to end back to where Rob started with our work at the Raindrop site. So hopefully now you've got a kind of a rough picture of how all this is going to work. So we want to use these robots. So this is a ground robot called a Husky. We want to use these robots to perform the same task, which is to accurately capture data on the biodiversity of these plots using hyperspectral imaging. So these robots, this robot here, which is being followed by 2 humans, because this is still in the testing phase, when we didn't quite trust the robot. And actually, if you're out there, it's just kind of fun to walk around. The robot is carrying one of these hyperspectral cameras, and its job is to visit all the grassland plots and image them. So we've got these sites, we've got some nice maps. So Rob made us lovely maps with his drones that tell us where all the plots are. And within the AI robotics stream, what we've been doing is actually taking the same approach that we've taken in these other projects of building this kind of route map that the robot can follow. So here, what we've done, these small squares within each plot is the road is kind of this is the bit that's targeted when they're doing studies, and these are the bits the robots are imaging. So the robot drives up the side, parks by that square on these dots, points the camera there, grabs some hyperspectral imaging, drives off again. And we can just about cover the whole of these plots in a single mission. It's a bit touch and go. And as the robot ages, actually, its battery gets worse. So it's not necessarily easy to do. And so we need to use our planning technology, like we saw with the underwater robot, to decide at what time of day should I gather what data from which plot, right? We can't, it's an interesting trade-off. We think these robots can do lots of things, but they can't be at all places at all times. So if you're looking to discover, say, a correlation between weather and when a plant flowers, or you're looking for particular biodiversity data under particular environmental conditions, you need to exploit that information to get the robot there at the same time as those conditions are happening. And so we need to not only have this robot, but as Rob said, we're developing in situ sensors to monitor these environments. So we've built some kind of weather stations that we're sticking in all these plots. This is Charlotte Crane, so she's a third-year engineer. She was sponsored by Geraldini sponsorship. So another donation that paid for her to work over the summer building an IoT platform that can sit there. So IoT, Internet of Things, that means a bunch of sensors connected to some network that allows us to upload data to the cloud. And that means we're getting data from these plots almost in real time. So this is the last couple of, it's like 3 weeks of data. This is ambient light, soil temperature, wind speed. So this data has been gathered on every plot. And our robot has access to this data. So our robot is sitting in what we call a kennel. That's not a technical term, that's just what we're calling it. It sits in the kennel, it's looking at this data, and it can decide, okay, given the models Rob's team are creating, under which conditions do I want to see what data? And it's also using this to say, if it's raining, I don't really want to go outside. So we're able to use this data to build predictive models, as well as these kind of species diversity models, and use that to decide when to go out. These are small plots. That's of interest. So the other challenge we've got here is really, how does this robot, so I talked about localization, how does the robot know where it is? In the spot example, we're using this LiDAR, so we've got the same LiDAR on top of the robot up there. That LiDAR needs to reflect off things. There's nothing for that LiDAR to reflect off here, okay? There's no walls, there's no structure. We need the robot to accurately park by the site to image the same spot every day. GPS is not accurate enough to do that. Ultimately, what we're going to do is use radar. So I work with Paul Newman's group, mobile robotics group in the Robotics Institute, and they do a lot of work on radar localization. So this big kind of clown hat thing here is actually a radar. It's a radar that they put on motorway bridges to count cars. It turns out to be very, very good for autonomy as well. But that's still early stage research. So instead, what we're doing is something called visual teach and repeat. So visual teach and repeat as our localization mechanism uses the camera on the front of the robot. And what we do is we teach the robot by driving it once on a particular path. And then what the robot tries to do, when you put it back at the start of the path, it tries to match the images it's seeing now to the images that it saw previously the last time it drove that path. So the robot here is repeating. So we taught it once to get the path. Now we're repeating this action for the robot to perform the behavior. And what you see, the graph down in the bottom left, is kind of how accurately it's able to match its memory to the current location. And on the right, you can see places, kind of features that are matching. So bits of two images that match well. So on the left, you've got the live data that's coming from the robot. On the right, you've got the previous experience on the map data. This works really, really well if you drive the robot once and then repeat it immediately. What you can see here is these two images look very, very similar. As the time of day changes, as plants die, as the grass grows, these things get less and less accurate. And the research from Paul Newman's group has been looking at how you take different experiences, so how you look at the environment over different times and use them to still localize, even if the world starts to look a little bit different. And what that does, it actually populates down here. You see multiple experiences. So you might have an experience when it's snowy. You might have an experience in dust. And that allows you to robustly use your repeated experience in the environment to localize in these settings. It's also the same technology that's being used now in Oxbotica in their autonomous vehicles. So this kind of visual localization and tracking for navigation. So that's how we're moving the robot around. And then ultimately, we're going to put all this together. Well, that's the aim. We've got all the component parts. Not a lot of it is speaking yet, but we're getting close. So the aim is to put all these things together to gather the data autonomously with the robots, to ground truth some of it and then apply the multispectral imaging, to chuck it all into the cloud and then build effectively a digital twin of the site, right? So we've got a model, we've got 3D models, we've got GPS, we've got everything. And then we've got these kind of live weather stations, we've got robot images. So it's a really amazing resource to study biodiversity and the effects of climate change in these kinds of environments at a level of spatial and temporal granularity that hasn't been possible before. So that's the big aim. I've got one final slide on kind of where next, and that's a bit of me and a bit of Rob. So 2023 is the year all this happens together. So the last 2 summers we've been out and about. The robot, Rob's work's been amazing. Our robot's been a bit flaky, I have to say, but we're getting there. We've also had funding from EPSRC to explore how we can apply this methodology to other sites with the aim of actually generating impact with businesses. So we've been talking to partners who make money by having lovely environments around them and caring for the natural environment. People like Blenheim Palace and Berkshire and Buckinghamshire and Oxfordshire Wildlife Trust. So they are in charge, they're stewards of the environment, and they're also very interested in these kind of technologies. So we're going to deploy our systems and test them at a few different environments. I'm about to go on sabbatical. I'm hoping to spend my sabbatical programming more underwater robots with the National Oceanography Centre to do some work with the Met Office. So that's super exciting. And we've also, between Rob and I, are talking to people, other Pembroke folk, in fact, that monitor much larger ecosystems, so large mammals roaming around Africa. And you want to kind of count them, monitor them, study their movements, but you can't just put a stick in the ground and have the robot go to the stick every day because the mammals aren't there. So you have to do much larger scale planning, localization, and reasoning. Okay, that is us done. I'm going to stick a final slide up that hopefully plays in the background. And I think we're happy to take questions. Emma, how do we do this with the online folks as well?
People can submit their questions online. We've had one through already. Is using sonar sensors possibly problematic for
Cetaceans?
Yes.
In ocean environments?
It absolutely is. So the work we've been doing, so the devices here were developed, I'm blanking his name, I'm afraid, a colleague at Newcastle University who was specifically looking at the effects of underwater signal propagation on underwater life. So these are kind of dolphin-friendly underwater sensors, effectively. So we're trying hard not to disturb the natural habitats as much as we can. So yes, they can be problematic. So like straightforward sonar, yes. So you have to calibrate these things quite carefully.
There's actually been issues.
Yeah, come.
So there's been a lot of legislation in the last decade or two having to do with maritime traffic. As the planet has become more globalized, there's been a big emphasis on trying to concentrate the ways through which big ships are connecting the dots, right? In an effort to really not perturb every single animal in the water, right? So kind of like analogous to the work that has shown that having green corridors on land can really protect or at least diminish the loss of biodiversity. Blue corridors are actually being developed for marine ecosystems where these type of activities are no longer allowed.
We had 2 questions pre-submitted when people signed up online. So the first one is, forgive my pronunciation, is the Anthropocene really a new era, or did it begin with domestication of plants and animals in the Neolithic?
So let me get a bit linguistic here. Anthropo means human, right? So it's the new era, whose hallmark is human actions, right? The way that deep time geologists define geological eras is by abrupt drastic changes, right? Domestication is not really an abrupt change. What has been an abrupt change has been the Industrial Revolution. The fact that, for instance, humans have come to create a greater volume of man-made architecture than the total summation of body mass of all animals together. We have got more buildings than we have got animals. So that is a drastic change. So the Anthropocene is defined as for the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. obviously domestication happened quite a long time after that. So yes, it's a new era, but it doesn't go back to as far back as perhaps the question said.
And the second question is, even if all CO3 promises are kept and climate catastrophe averted, it seems to me that there is still an energy gap. Our descendants will need to generate more and consume more efficiently. Can we mine for rare earths without destroying the land, or mine comets? I don't believe nuclear fusion will ever be cheap though, but how feasible are solar panels in orbit, and what are the limits to using energy more efficiently? There are a lot of questions in that one question.
That's like an Oxford engineering interview question. I'm going to claim I'm not an expert enough to answer any of those, I don't think. I think fusion is pretty cool. I'm back in fusion. I don't have an answer to that.
I maybe say the same thing. I'm not an expert in a lot of those areas, but trade-offs are inescapable. Resources are limited. We don't live in a world where we can continue to grow exponentially. And so compromises will have to be achieved. One thing that is true, I think that solar panels were mentioned. The technology is developing so fast, and the prices are obviously going down. And maybe one of the only benefits of climate change is more warming, potentially more sun, more energy from our perspective. But I just constrain myself to what I know, and I admit that I'm not an expert in the topics that were mentioned.
I will just plug robots for solar. I mean, it's a really, I think there's lots of things that need to be done to move us towards net zero.
Yeah.
And I'm hopeful the robots will play a part in that. So we've been doing work, for example, on just monitoring and cleaning solar farms. So keeping solar panels at high efficiency really you need to keep them clean, and actually detecting when they're clean, when they're dirty. Often it's bird poo, and getting something to clean them is in a timely fashion.
Expensive.
Yeah, it's a nice place to bring robots in. So that also in terms of construction of these sites, it's important. Yes, go.
I was just wondering about the robustness of the robots. So they're good in different weather conditions, and how the battery life, is there a way we can improve that sustainably?
Yeah. Okay, you have to stop there. Otherwise, you turn into that previous question. Sorry, that's very rude, wasn't it? You can ask another question after that. Let me answer that.
Yes.
So robustness. The two questions: robustness and battery life. It really depends on which robots you're using. So the Spot, the legged robot, and the underwater robot, the Eco Sub, both commercially developed robots and really quite robust. Like you can break Spot, you can flip it, and you can make it fall downstairs and it doesn't break. But it's not the most robust system. But in general, that will survive a bunch of stuff. In terms of weather conditions, Spot is let's get this one right. There's IP ratings, which are kind of environmental protection ratings, and it can survive a light rainstorm, but not heavy directed water pressure. So you can get it out and about in other conditions. Battery life is sort of 2 to 4 hours, depending on the payload. So it's enough to do a decent amount of work, and then you can recharge it for a few hours. And so actually, if you're in a large scale space, you often want a team of robots that are kind of taking turns charging and using. Eco Sub, similar battery life, again, very robust underwater. The robot we're using at Raindrop is very much a research platform. So it's wires exposed, power things floating in thin air, not robust at all. A rough car journey will mean you have to spend some time with a screwdriver. But that's kind of the way we work. We do these things, and then when we're going to deploy it in the field, we will 3D print beautiful smooth covers and waterproof it and seal it up and things. So at the moment it's a work in progress. But we have robots that run similar payloads that run for 12 hours, for example. So you can do quite significant kind of missions, large scale in those instances. The final comment on battery life is the real aim for a lot of the marine work is using these things called gliders or sloping gliders. So these are platforms that change their buoyancy and generate, they kind of yaw. So they make themselves a little bit heavier, sink down, change their buoyancy, come up again. And you do that in a repeated S pattern. You build up this very low energy momentum, basically. And then you can basically set them out to sea for months at a time, and then they can just float on the surface and recharge with solar. So those are the platforms we're interested in working with. The problem is you have to make sure that you avoid very strong weather conditions because they just moving around, and you need to find those solar recharge spots. You need to make sure you're surfaced in the sun. So there are planning problems there.
Thank you.
Did you have a follow-up? Sorry, before I interrupted.
Another question was just about sustainability going forward with battery design, but that's a slightly different question that we're covering here. So, let's let you combine that.
That question, actually, if I may add up as well, is also pertinent to the drone technology, right? And actually, during my time in this project, I witnessed a drastic improvement in the battery lifespan of these creatures, as I like to call them. The challenge, however, is that drones are not really good friends of rain. So rotor-based unmanned aerial vehicles, you cannot launch a mission when it's really certain, let alone raining, right? And it rains a lot here. Fixed wing unmanned aerial vehicles do better, but they're not perfect either in rough conditions. But going back to the battery, when I started this project, the average battery lifespan of the drones that we first purchased was about 15 to 20 minutes. We're now at 50. I mean, it's only been 4 years.
Any additional risks involved in using robots?
It depends. So if there's a whole sort of scope of questions around that. For these kind of tasks, almost no. As long as the things I care about most is, are we actually generating good data? And so the risk is that if Rob and his team took their hands off the wheel and went, hey, these robots are gathering all the data I need. And then 3 years later, after you published a bunch of papers, you came and looked and went, hang on a minute, this is actually really inconsistent on low quality, or you know, your localization says you're always at this location, but it turns out there's a lot of noise in that signal. There's a danger, I think, that we could be generating crap for you, and we may not notice. We may accept it because it's data, and we can throw a neural network at it or something cool. But in reality, it may not actually contain enough signal. Otherwise, particularly if these are sites that are a long way away from people. Okay, so there is a risk. There is the thing that keeps me up at night is I showed you that image of the plots with the little kind of squares. Those squares are super valuable. That's where all the history of the raindrop sites are. Our robots could just drive on them and mess them up. So that's the thing I worry about most. That's one of the reasons we're using these
It just goes under.
Yeah. So if the robot gets lost, it needs to know that it shouldn't drive. So we're using methods that kind of measure the certainty of the robot in its position as well. Because some methods just go, oh, I know I am, I'm fine, and it turns out they don't. So you need to track the kind of confidence of the robot's state estimator to know where it is.
I think, well, I really value you being so careful about this. I think it would be okay if it's accidentally one stroke or one of the permanent plots in Western Woods. These grasslands, as it turns out, we've been able to quantify, they're quite resilient to disturbances like this. I mean, the mechanical disturbance, we did the mechanical disturbance for which we actually bulldozed the first layer of the soil entirely. And within 3 months, we already had grasses coming back. So they're really, really resilient. The challenge, however, is when we deploy these to faraway places that are mostly dominated by highly endemic and very fragile species. So we want to try this in the Karoo deserts, in the north side of South Africa, high degree of endemisms. There's this precious plants called lithops or living rocks. If the robot goes over them, it kills it. There's no coming back.
Yeah, and they're very hard to see. So that's going to be a challenge.
Questions online. One from Benjamin, a long time with you. I'm wondering more about the use cases for systems like outside of field science. Are the biodiversity metrics we are targeting fit for purpose outside of field science?
Well, that's a really, hello again. Good to see you. It's been a while indeed. That is a really problematic question, because what we are seeing is that governments, not just here, but in many other countries around the globe, are using very rudimentary metrics still to quantify biodiversity. And we would love for them to be able to pick up these pipelines, to automatize and for these metrics to become the gold standard. They are accurate. There's still room for improvement, of course. The linear correlations that we show you, the R-square, which is an index of goodness of fit, is about 0.7. You want it to be at 1, which means that whatever you see with the drones is exactly what you get with the classical botanical methods, right? But the scope that we cover with them can actually make up for the R-square not being 1, right? So the challenge that we actually have to face next, maybe phase 3, phase 4, is taking this matrix and make them be implemented very carefully at the governmental level. Hopefully that answers the question. Let's see if it says yes or no.
Maybe just to add to that, one of the interesting applications that we haven't thought about so much here, but I mean, it comes and goes with governments, but the public money for public goods agenda. So where you want farmers to treat their farms in a particular way, you need to actually monitor the effects that their treatments are having in order to generate payments. So there's actually this kind of technology applied to agriculture. So outside of it's kind of straight up climate or biodiversity monitoring, there are real kind of industry or commercial applications.
And that's actually a really good point, because, and it's really timely now in the era of Brexit, right? Before Brexit, we had a lot of investment from the European Commission funds that would promote promote certain actions from farmers. The new governmental plan for that is not very clear in terms of how these actions are being monitored and rewarded accordingly. Maybe because, again, we go back to square one, they're really tedious to check. But the drones and the robots might actually be able to expedite that, and satellites as well, right?
Question from Angus. I'm a bit challenged by the concept of uninteresting data that doesn't warrant collection. Surely you can only prove it was uninteresting once you've collected it, and who knows if it might be interesting in the future.
So, I mean, yeah, more, like almost any computer science will tell you is more data is better data. So we like the aim here is to collect as much data as possible. There is a cost though, and there's a climate cost. So what we do is we then go and upload this to a computer in the cloud that is using electricity, or is has stuff mined to put in. So you have to trade off on various levels.
Yeah.
And if we could tell what was valuable to start, I mean, like it's probably in the context of these underwater sensors. So if you've got a really accurate model that predicts the variation in temperature and salinity for a particular part of your network, you only need to collect the data that varies from that. So if you've got a model that sits on the sensor and says, I'm making the same predictions here that the cloud is making, for example.
Yeah.
And the data always looks at the predictions, and that sensor knows that no one needs this data because the model already captures it. So that data is uninteresting, and you could recreate it with a few lines of code somewhere else. So it's only when the data varies from your predictions that it becomes interesting. And if the whole point of doing this is to build those predictive models, then you can think about that in a very, I think, clean way. But that's because we're saying these systems are modeled and understood already. If we don't have models and we don't understand them, then more data is definitely better.
Two other questions. Sasha, I'm interested in the comparison between robotics and animal biologging. I wonder if there are any insights you gained from both. Biologging animal attached sensors tells us a lot about an animal experience and surroundings, but little about the areas that choose not to visit, whereas robotics are for the following environment.
Can I take a first?
Yeah.
Just to complement. I think we need to target this challenge of climate change and biodiversity loss with as many tools as we possibly can. So for me, it's not either or, it's the complementarity that they offer, right? The example with the drones and the robots perhaps is a really good one, right? So drones can do things that robots cannot, and vice versa. We can fly, and different types of drones as well. We can fly specific type of drones under the canopy and others over the canopy to get the full holistic dynamics of the forest. So biologging has its place. It's actually developed tremendously in the last 20 years. And I don't really think that these type of tools are going to replace that. I think that they offer a complementary layer.
Yeah, there's some interesting. I think one of the interesting places where you get synergies between these two systems is that for biologging, you can't get real-time data typically. So these are tags that are attached to the animal. To have a long lifetime, they have to particularly not have a radio antenna. So they log data, they log the satellite feeds, but they don't rebroadcast it. So they're just gathering data. And that means they can last a lot longer at a single power, single charge. But that means you don't get any real-time data if you're monitoring the system. So we've been thinking a little bit about how you can use robots to go in the same way that the underwater vehicle goes around the sensors and pulls the data off the sensor. If you had a predictive model of where the animals are going, you can then use a robot to get nearby, gather the data off their data loggers, and return home. So you wouldn't need to have them using satellite comms or something. You could go and gather data off the devices locally.
And actually, this is a really interesting conversation. We should discuss this over here,
Yes.
which is that some of these biologgers have got a time of release. The time of release being either when the animal dies, or a set time, maybe a few seconds before the battery completely dies, at which the collar or the ear ping or whatever gets detached. And if it happens to get detached in a really remote area, then we have to go pick it up.
Yeah.
Or we can send the robots.
One question from online from Jeff Squire. Is there scope to upscale your methodology to satellite and achieve often real imaging and the European Space Agency?
Yes. The answer. Yeah. So that works in two ways. So there's lots of interesting work now on kind of satellite sensing for environmental disturbances. So people using, basically like almost real-time satellite imaging, looking at how the world changes. They're doing things like flood alerts, stuff like that. You'd certainly want to respond to those kind of changes if they were incoming. There's some early work from the Institute on using that to build the maps the robots localized for. So this, I think, we originally thought about for space exploration. So if you drop a rover on a planet, currently the rover is using lots of human interaction, but if you had a satellite above it, you could use the satellite to map the area and help the robot plan where it's going. We'd like to be able to do that even just for kind of quick deployments of these systems. So you're in a new area and you don't know necessarily where you want your robot to move or how it's going to localize, but you can use your satellite images just to inform the robot for its localization. But again, that kind of data is really valuable, seeing it from different perspectives with different images over time.
I'm always amazed by every time that I open Google Earth, which I did actually yesterday on a different project that I had to explain properly. I am amazed by the resolution gain from one year to the next. You can actually now peruse through the city of Oxford, where the trees are rendered in 3D. Last year, you didn't have that. You had some of the colleges. The entire city of Oxford is not in 3D. And that information is invaluable, right? Say that you want to monitor the health of trees in the city. The loss in canopy volume is a good indicator of the tree collapse. So that has incredible value, not just from a biological perspective, but also in terms of urban planning, risk management as well. The technology is just advancing. Every time that I open documents and things like that, there's like a much bigger volume of data.
Then the other thing is satellite comms. So we'd like our systems out in the wild to communicate, and often there isn't a Wi-Fi network or 4G, but there are satellites overhead. So it's a different angle. It's not using the imaging, but we're certainly interested in using it as a comms network as well. You got a question, Dan? You normally have a question.
Maybe could be a long one.
Okay. Should we not then?
Well, I was going to say, first of all, it's sort of great to see the sort of inter-departmental collaborations for moving theoretically possible things through to done it. What a great advert for a collegiate system.
Can I make a comment on that before I sorry to interrupt you before I hear your question, and that is that I've got an accent, right? I'm from Spain, right? I've worked in 3 different continents for 11 different universities. Only here have I been able to disseminate this. It's the college that has a lot of dissemination. So I'm really, really excited about the work that we've done. I'm even more so for the future work. And I'm really grateful to the college for that.
Well, I'm just finding out how many times you've been fired, and I'm a little bit nervous. So that's
I've been a lot of postdocs. Short contracts.
And I guess it's somewhat an answer to some of the earlier questions, but a lot of this research is benefiting from scale deployments of similar or the same technologies in other industries. So a lot of these tools are now, it's kind of the answer to the insurance question, high assurance industries that are reason we have robotics, no shortage of irony, a lot of that comes from oil and gas. And other sort of high assurance areas, same base batteries, autonomous transport. It's great to see anticipation of those things maturing and working on this missing bits of blue, so that when we do have small drones that can fly for hours, right? It's to make them useful for this stuff. So how do we, I guess, the question that's sort of running around in my head is how do we take the academic success and deploy it so it's actually, you know, impactful at scale. It's obviously where you guys are thinking on the realm of interdepartmental sort of collaboration. Is this not a challenge that could be thrown to some of the MBA students at Pembroke to, you know, here is the set of pieces that a solution has to have. I need a business model that can self-fund and self-sustain. Go and find 20 and kick the tires of those and tell me what works.
That would be interesting. I mean, that's pretty much what we've got this impact accelerator account fund, which is find a way of making a business from this. Not that that's necessarily what we want to do, but it's to keep that technology coming through. But yeah, we are uniquely unqualified to do that. So finding other humans to help us actually good. We haven't thought about that. We're just going to go and talk to companies and say, hey, we've got robots. What do you want to do? Yeah. But that's probably not the best way of doing it. So actually finding some MBA students is a really good idea.
There's probably Pembroke students looking for a project.
Yeah.
The first time that the word business case was thrown at me in this context, I am a biologist. I've never encountered that word before. I mean, business case, what is that? I actually have to go away.
It's like a briefcase.
Exactly, right? So very much not trained in that area. I now understand, I think vaguely, and this is superficially what it means, but I'm acutely aware that we need somebody else involved in this. And studentships will be one.
Yeah.
You want to work in that area?
I'm a little busy.
I got it.